Welcome to another episode of A Brother with Questions. I am your host, B. Period. Man, I appreciate you for joining me. Listen, this is going to be an interesting one tonight. Obviously, there is much going on in the news as it relates to Israel and Gaza Strip and Hamas and Palestine, and I wanted to share some thoughts to bring what I think balance to this conversation is my goal, because I know right now there is a lot of emotions by a lot of people, whether you're on one side or the other, which for me, I'm not on a side. I don't have a side in this fight, if you will. As an American, I'm not choosing sides. But I think there's a conversation that needs to be had, and breaking points. I don't know if you see it in the window there. They brought some interesting things to the conversation, and so I wanted you to play what they. I was going to play for what they said, and then comment a little bit as we go along. For those that may not be familiar with the platform, Breaking Points is headed up by two individuals, in particular, the young lady that you see in the video right now and a young man, and they sort of go counterpoint to each other. The young lady tends to be a little liberal. The young man that you'll see in a moment tends to be more conservative, and they kind of go back and forth to try and give you both sides of the argument. Whether you agree or not, of course, is always up to you. But they try and present both sides fairly, which is something we can't always say we see in mainstream media, as they call it. But before I get started, let me not forget to ask you to like and subscribe to the channel. If you like what we're doing, please hit the notification buttons as well. We are on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Spotify, Castbox. So wherever you want to listen, we try and be there for you. But let's get into this. Let's see what they have to say.
Also got some news for you with regard to how our own media is handling this conflict and who they are allowing on air and who they are allowing to voice their view and who they are not. So a lot to get into this morning. But let's go ahead and start with what we've got on the ground in Gaza this morning. Let's go ahead and put some of these images up on the screen. Of course, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, in particular northern Gaza, continues. These are images of the rubble at this point in Gaza City. Of course, they have issued evacuation orders for the more than 1 million residents of northern Gaza, pushing them south. This as that complete siege conditions continue. No food, no water, no electricity. And one of the big concerns this morning is you see this baby who is on an incubator, and this director of the main hospital in Gaza is that main hospital is actually in the evacuation zone. It is already overwhelmed based on the number of wounded who have been struck and severely injured in these strikes from Israel. And what you could see there is footage of people who are laid out on the floor because there are already not sufficient beds. The leadership of that hospital saying there is no way we can evacuate. There is no way we can move all of these severely wounded individuals. You can see people being brought into the hospitals here. So, thousands of people who depend on that hospital. You can already see the mass grave there that is being dug and filled in based on, again, this is in Gaza, the people who have been killed by Israeli strikes. And this is before we even consider any sort of ground invasion, which hasn't occurred. We're now looking at images out of Israel. This is courtesy of 60 Minutes. This is the fallout from the horrific carnage that was inflicted on many Israeli civilians. You can see here footage from that music festival, bodies laid out. I know these images are incredibly disturbing.
So let's take a pause.
We're going to get to this later.
So that's tough to see. That's tough to see. But it serves as a reminder that I understand why Israel is bombing Gaza in the methods that they are. You know, it's essentially out of, well, people aren't going to call it revenge. People are going to call it defending themselves. So obviously, you know, Hamas sent 5,000 rockets into Israel, blew up and stormed a music festival and kidnapped some people, killed some people. And so now Israel has responded in kind by destroying a lot of places in Gaza. And so the goal, of course, is to destroy Hamas. But I think that's the complicated challenge is how do you destroy Hamas without also injuring the people? Yeah, this right, for me, a lot of this just reminds me of 2000, September 11th. Because we had the same sentiments. We were attacked, unprovoked, if you will. And we responded in kind by ultimately bombing two countries. And for me, the correlations, they just keep lining up. Let's keep going.
Later, these are some of the protests that have been sparked around the world. In addition, Sagar, you know, one of the things I was looking at this morning is there's been this conversation about allowing aid convoys in, opening up the Egyptian border so there could be some sort of a humanitarian corridor established. Those negotiations, both sides, different stories about what's going on there. But the bottom line is there is no humanitarian corridor. That border has not been opened. And diplomatic officials are saying the reason that Egypt hasn't allowed those aid convoys in that they have massed at the border is because, number one, Israel already struck that border crossing. And number two, Israel will not promise to not strike those aid convoys coming in as well. So the situation is incredibly dire on a humanitarian front. And as I said, this is before we even get into any sort of ground invasion, which is what Israel is threatening.
Yeah, that's right. The Israelis say that they're not allowing for proper security screening.
So again, it's these complicated concepts. So obviously, they say 2 million people live in that area. I haven't heard anybody dispute this fact, so I'll just keep saying what they say. But out of the 2 million, 1 million of those are children. And in essence, they have nowhere to go. And Israel, rightfully so, wants to destroy Hamas. But how do you destroy Hamas without also obviously destroying Gaza and an extension the people? That's a complicated thing. How do you do that? Because even though there's humanitarian efforts, you heard the story, there's no one is letting these people out. So it's complicated.
Of said aid convoys. And this has, of course, now become the focal point of U.S. policy of really global energy as the entire world focuses on what's happening in Gaza. And the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, actually announced yesterday that water would be turned on back in southern Gaza outside of the evacuation zone. Here's what he had to say.
Take a listen to what Secretary Blinken said last year when Putin was targeting Ukrainian infrastructure.
Here's one thing you need to do before buying anything online. Don't spend another dime on Amazon until you watch this first.
Heat, water, electricity for children, for the elderly, for the sick. These are President Putin's new targets. He's hitting them hard. This brutalization of Ukraine's people is barbaric.
Now look, Israel is not Russia. Gaza is not Ukraine. It's a different situation. But cutting off supplies, cutting off heat, cutting off water to civilians, what's the difference?
Well, first, thank you for saying that Israel is not Russia, because Israel is not Russia.
But
Second,
civilians
as
are
I said
civilians,
before,
Jake.
we are in
Civilians are
constant
civilians.
contact. Yes, absolutely they are. And they deserve, as I said before, access to water and medicine and food. And we are working actively to ensure that that happens. And I can tell you this morning, Jake, that I have been in touch with my Israeli counterparts just within the last hour, who report to me that they have, in fact, turned the water pipe back on in southern Gaza. That has been the subject of discussion over the course of the past few days. The United States is going to continue working with Israel, with the UN, with Egypt, with Jordan, and with a lot of the groups on the ground to make sure that innocent Palestinians get access to those basic necessities and are protected from bombardment, because they deserve that right, the right to those necessities and the right to safety and security every bit as much as Ukrainian civilians do, or civilians anywhere do. And the United States hasn't made any bones about that. We're working hard on that. We're working to make sure that that is the case as this unfolds. And it's something that has been a high priority for President Biden, for Secretary Blinken, and for myself.
That's a pretty big deal, though, for Jake Sullivan to be the one announcing it. And
Yeah.
almost offhanded, to be honest, not though from Israeli officials, and hasn't yet really been confirmed all that much by Gaza officials.
Yeah, I mean, they're paying all this lip service, and Biden put out a tweet like, oh, we've got to make sure innocent lives are protected. And, you know, I expect Israel will follow international law with regards to, they're already not. I mean, that's the thing that drives me crazy, is they're pretending like they haven't already clearly violated international law and committed war crimes here when it's unfolding in front of our eyes. Good for Jake Taffer for asking this question. This is something you and I have been tracking. We may talk more about this yesterday, because you have all of this video of Antony Blinken and the head of the EU and all of these people, Zelensky, talking about what a war crime it is for Russia to be turning off electricity and messing with civilian infrastructure during a time of war. Suddenly, when it's Israel, it's like, well, it's different for reasons. But
This is, I mean, again, I don't have a dog in this fight. And I'm not here to tell you that Israel's bad and Hamas is good, Palestine's good, and Israel. I'm not here to make a judgment call on anybody, but I think that there has to be balance in this conversation. I look at it this way. Elected officials are elected to do what's right by the citizens of their country. And those decisions should be made not based on how you emotionally feel, but on what is right for now and in the future. And what is interesting about this situation is everybody's reacting emotionally. Like, there's got to be somebody in the room who is logical about this. Not because they don't feel something, or because they don't have empathy, or because they don't understand. But the whole point of, they say, studying history is so you can learn from it. And so we don't have to go back 100 years to learn from history. We just need, if you just go back 20 years, we can learn some history. We can reflect on what happens when you haphazardly begin to bomb a country in an effort to get rid of terrorists. Again, I understand why they're doing it. But if I'm looking at history and learning from it, can anybody tell us what we gained from Iraq and Afghanistan? Let's keep going.
specifically with regard to this idea that, oh, they turned back on the water pipe. That's not really how things work. And also, if you don't have electricity, then you can't pump that water, and it's not actually doing anyone any good. So a reporter on Al Jazeera explained some of the logistics and mechanics of this. Let's take a listen to that.
Also, the blackout of electricity inside Gaza is a main factor that even providing water to the Gaza Strip won't be enough, simply because without electricity, Gazans won't be able to fill the water tanks. So with the ongoing blackout of electricity inside Gaza, the humanitarian crisis inside the Gaza Strip will continue and will deteriorate more.
So in the best of times, the infrastructure in Gaza is incredibly compromised.
Yeah, it's
and
a nightmare.
in the best of times, under the current, typical Israeli blockade, you have the majority of the citizens without access to clean water. So now when you have no electricity, you have no ability to pump that water. The one power plant that does exist in Gaza has already run out of fuel. Hospitals having to rely on a generator. I mean, it is an incredibly dire situation. Again, you're talking about 2.2 million people. You're talking about a densely packed enclave. You're talking about nearly a majority of those individuals are children. Hundreds of children have been killed already in these assaults. Again, this is before the huge exodus. This is before the ground invasion potentially begins. So there is a lot to be concerned about here. With regard to Americans, because remember, there were a number of Americans who were killed
Before
by
she
Hamas
goes and talks
in
about
those
the
assaults.
Americans, these are my questions. So, because of the attack from Hamas, are we supposed to not have any feelings for non-Hamas members? Are we supposed to ignore the plight of quote unquote free Palestinians? These are my questions. And I'm not trying, and again, I don't say that to condemn Israel, because I understand. They're doing exactly what the United States did when 2 planes went into the Twin Towers, when a plane went down near the Pentagon, when a plane went down in Pennsylvania. We mounted up and we quickly went in and bombed Afghanistan and Iraq. So I understand the sentiment, because as Americans, we were there 20 years ago. We were doing the exact same thing. So I understand that part. But I'm still reflecting on history. My question is, and will always be, what do we gain from Iraq and Afghanistan? Let's keep going.
Assaults, and we think some Americans who have been potentially taken hostage and a number who continue to be unaccounted for. Interesting development here. I mean, horrible development here. Put this up on the screen. So as of yesterday, these are the overall casualty numbers. We've got 1,300 who were killed in Israel, over 3,000 who were wounded. In Gaza now, we have over 2,300 who have been killed and nearly 10,000 who have been wounded. With regard to the U.S., put this next piece up on the screen. They're now saying that 30 Americans have been killed. Yesterday, the count was 29. Now it's risen to 30. But this is interesting, Sagar. They'll no longer comment any further on the circumstances of the U.S. citizen deaths. Jeff Stein taking particular note of this. And the reason why this is significant is because, remember, if you have Americans who are held hostage in Gaza right now, it could be the case that they are dying not at the hands directly of Hamas, although Hamas obviously bears quite a lot of responsibility since they're the ones who frickin' took them hostage. But when you have Israel mounting this overwhelming bombing campaign, dropping more bombs in Gaza than we dropped in Afghanistan over, a number of years, some of those Americans could be getting killed right now.
Did you hear that? They've dropped more bombs in Gaza than we dropped in years in Afghanistan. I just wanted to let that marinate. And nobody seems to have a problem with the elimination of Hamas.
By Israeli fire. And this is, we're going to talk about the Israel domestic political context. There you have the latest number I saw is potentially 200 hostages that were taken by Hamas. The families and a lot of supporters of the families very concerned about their lives. And protecting them and seeing if they can be brought back, if there can be some sort of negotiations to bring them home. So that's why it's so noteworthy that the U.S. government will no longer discuss the circumstances surrounding these American deaths.
Yeah, I agree. And also, it comes in the face of we also need to know how many American citizens are inside Gaza. The current number is somewhere around 500 or 600 U.S. citizens. Breaking actually this morning, Crystal, is that the Rafah crossing in Egypt might be opening for a few hours at 9 a.m. time local for foreign nationals specifically to cross. It could come. This is just from a White House spokesperson.
Yeah, well, we'll see, because they said that before and it
right.
didn't happen.
It didn't happen, exactly. Yeah. And it's because there was also an insistence from Egypt's side. They said we'll only open the crossing for foreign nationals to come across as long as aid convoys are allowed to cross in. So could indicate, this is just from a White House spokesperson minutes ago. They say they hope in order to open it.
We'll see.
We'll see. Everybody, remain on standby. Overall, the situation remains dire, largely because so many people are unable to flee from the northern evacuation zone, approximately 1 million people. In the past, what we often observed in Syria, whenever people were able to leave cities like Aleppo or others, it's really retirees. I mean, if you think back to Hurricane Katrina or any of the other times in which we have a major disaster here in which a lot of people flee, most of the time, the people who remain are unfortunately the old, the sick, the infirm who are unable to do so. And then sometimes, also we've got people in the hospital system, as you said, which are overwhelmed. International organizations inside the hospital saying that they're unable to go because they not only have patients, but they don't have the existing infrastructure in the South. And that's all before we see what this coming invasion is going to look like into Gaza. The current indication that we've seen from Israeli military plans that have been released is that they will have basically a full-blown urban war against Hamas leadership, militants, and infrastructure. Hamas's extensive tunnel network all throughout Gaza, and specifically northern Gaza. That's how they believe that many of the weapons and the people were able to cross in the first place, although, their vaunted border security fence also literally just moved open with a piece of construction equipment. That seems to be an issue. Anyway, that appears to be what it is for now.
So it's coming. We know they've been talking about it. Israel is going to do a ground strike as well and march their troops into the Gaza to kill Hamas. And so you can imagine from this particular effort, there will be more bloodshed. And they will keep going until they know all of Hamas is dead. And so for me, I'm just pondering, when does it end? And I apologize, but I keep thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan. Because I don't know about what I imagine most Americans are feeling like the Israelis right now. We got to get them and we got to show them that they can never do this to us again. And I understand that sentiment. But I also look at it like a marriage. So in a marriage, you typically, right, it's two people, a man and a woman. Women generally are more emotional than men. And so if things are happening, the emotional part of the relationship typically is going to come probably from that woman first. And then the man is left to pick up the pieces in the sense that he has to find a way to get out of this situation, to manage the situation without letting his emotions drive him. And as I listen, I keep wanting to know, who is going to have a non-emotional conversation about how to get out of this. Because you got to get out of this. You can't do this for years. So you have to know what the exit strategy is. What's the exit strategy?
Officials off the record are saying that occupation is, quote, not on the table, that that's not what they want to do, but we don't know. I mean, you could technically say that we won't occupy something, but you could stay for 6 months to a year while you have clearing operations. At the very least, I mean, they are expecting significant amounts of Israeli casualties because this is probably going to be a bloody urban conflict, the likes of which the world has not seen in a long time. I mean, the Battle of Mosul is probably the most analogous from 2017, I believe, between the Iraqi security forces and ISIS, and that was a absolutely savage conflict. It's like not even block by block, but city house by house fighting that occurred, and it was horrible for the civilian population also that was there, and the city really never recovered either.
There are more and more 9/11 parallels here, both in the horror of the initial attack, the shock of the public, the way it changed their whole conception of safety and security and what it would take to, feel like they and their families are going to be safe. But also, the way we went into Iraq, which obviously was based on a pack of lies, but there was also no plan for the aftermath. And I'm looking at, what Israel is planning here. It's easy for them with all of their, equipment and modern weaponry supplied in part by us to come in and bomb the hell out of Gaza City. Like they're already doing that. That's easy, right? The ground invasion, I mean, I'm sure Hamas will put up whatever fight they can, but that also, in a sense, is easy for them. But it's easy to say we're going to take out all of Hamas's political and military leadership. But what then? What then? Is it just, more Hamas come in to fill the void? Is there a separate government that's going to come in? Are you going to do nation building in Gaza? Are you going to occupy Gaza and run it yourself? I haven't heard any answers to those questions. And those are very big questions. So it's a lot more complex than just coming in and bombing the hell out of the people who live here. You have to have some plan for what are you going to do next? Who is going to govern? How are you going to relate to those people who are governing? And clearly, you've seen, even if you don't give a shit about the Palestinian people, if you care about your own people, you've seen the way that all of your modern gadgets, tech, etc., can be thwarted by, a few $100 drones and a bulldozer. So
I told you that I like their conversations because, unlike traditional media, they're going to have the conversation that needs to be had. The one thing I have not heard in any conversation is what is the next? Because Israel, they got our blessing here. And by us, I mean the United States. So whatever they want to accomplish, they're going to get done. Whatever Hamas is or isn't, they're not Israel with the backing of the United States. They're just not. So we can go in there and we have the power to blow up that whole city. If that's what they desire. And I don't know what they want, but I get it. I mean, whatever it takes is what they say they're going to do. But what's next? There's still 1 million children. That's what I think about. I can't imagine a city, one city having 1 million children in it. And for the most part, children are homeless. I mean, not homeless, helpless. What's going to happen to those children? Does anybody care about those children? And I'm speaking outside of the families, of course. Because the U.S. is giving a bunch of lip service. And I hear what they're saying. But I also know I've heard very few people not say Israel should do whatever they need to do. Everybody's saying Israel should do whatever they need to do.
What then? And, you know, you're also seeing a level of dehumanization, which is really abhorrent. The Israeli president, Herzog, he made some comments about how debunking, quote unquote, the idea that there are innocent civilians, because his thinking is that, well, some of these Palestinians support Hamas, so, you know, they are basically complicit here. This is the same logic that Osama bin Laden used to justify 9/11. Well, the Americans elect these governments that do these awful things. This is the same type of logic that Hamas would use with regards to Israeli citizens. Hey, and does use, exactly. Hey, they elected these governments. And you know what? When you're talking about America and Israel, places that are basically democracies, there's actually more of a connection between the citizenry and the government than, you know, when was the last time there was election in Gaza? It was 17 years ago, I believe. Innocent civilians are innocent civilians. And you're seeing some of this, you know, horrible hate crime that appears to have unfolded in Chicago, where a 6-year-old Palestinian American child was stabbed to death by a landlord that they're investigating as a hate crime, potentially because of his Palestinian and Muslim roots. So it is horrifically ugly what is unfolding right now. And there are many more questions than answers about where we go from here. The last piece of this with regard to Israel, go ahead and put this up on the screen. Human Rights Watch has confirmed that white phosphorus was used in Gaza and Lebanon. They say that it put civilians at risk of serious and long-term injuries. They verified videos that were taken in Lebanon and Gaza on October 10th and 11th. This was something that was a subject of a lot of speculation online, because there were videos that appear to show the use of white phosphorus. It can cause severe burns in people. It can set structures, fields, and other civilian objects in the vicinity on fire. The use of white phosphorus in Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, they say, magnifies the risk to civilians and violates international humanitarian law, prohibition on putting civilians at unnecessary risk. Israel, though, adamantly denies the use, but, you know, the video evidence seems pretty clear.
Yeah, white phosphorus munitions are specifically banned by international law specifically in populated areas by civilian populations. And you can go and you can read about past U.S. use of white phosphorus munitions in Vietnam, where it really became famous, but really we saw deployment of it by, I believe it was Syrian and Russians, you know, inside of the battle for Aleppo and all throughout Syria. And it was horrible, what it inflicts really on the civilian population, which is what we're keeping an eye on. So look, it's all pretty nightmarish where we are right now. We've already got several thousand killed already on both sides, and the invasion has not even begun. So with the invasion, you can really only expect things to go exponential, especially if we see an urban campaign combined with a air superiority that the Israelis have and their ability, and then not even mentioning here the nightmare of a two-front war, which we will get to in a little bit.
So I told y'all they were trying to be balanced. I told you they were trying to be balanced. Check them out, man. They do great news stories over there at Breaking Points. That's the name of the YouTube channel. But it just reminds me so much of 2001. And I don't think we did at the time either. I felt like we went in there and we had one purpose. We were going to bomb the mess out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And when we finished bombing them, we'd figure out what to do with what was left behind. And while that was our strategy then, I think someone should have learned a lesson by now, that strategy doesn't work. We see the results of it. We were unable to rebuild Iraq to what we thought was going to be some kind of democratic haven. We were haphazardly rushed out of Afghanistan after we were basically tired of defending it. And the results are we lost billions of dollars that Americans will never see again, that added to our national debt with no real goal. Yes, we can tout our head on killing Osama bin Laden, but the Taliban organization that he headed is running Afghanistan yet again. And so I don't know that in Gaza, Israel is going to kill the head of Hamas, and 20 years later, the head of Hamas is going to be running Gaza again. Obviously, we can't speak and guarantee that to happen. But there's got to be some adults in charge here that are thinking about the future and plotting out what happens next before they make moves. Because in my opinion, that was the failure of America in 2001. I don't think we knew what we were doing after we bombed the mess out of those countries. We just knew that once we did it, we had to figure something out. And clearly, whatever we thought didn't work. And perhaps I'm wrong, and Israel has a great plan for the Gaza Strip once they finish bombing it and destroying Hamas. And we just aren't privy to that. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they do. But as it's playing out right now, I'm just wondering what's next. And as a country that's Christian, I'm not saying that it's time to forgive Hamas. That's not my point. But as Christians, I certainly think we ought to be seeking God to understand what's next. And I don't know that his solution would be bomb the mess out of Hamas. I just don't know. And what does that look like for us? What is it we're going to need to do now in order to assist in bombing the mess out of Hamas? And are we prepared to send Americans into this fight? To destroy Hamas. To eliminate Hamas amongst, they say they hide out amongst civilians. So are we prepared to defend Israel amongst the civilians? And there's some other stories out there that some of the neighboring countries aren't happy with our blanket support. And some of them, they say, are threatening to at least monitor the situation to see what we do and how we respond. And nobody has said that they're coming to defend Hamas, but everybody's saying they're watching our response. And what do they do later if we don't respond correctly? Whatever that is. I'm just wondering, when are they going to have these conversations in mainstream media? Because we get the Israel's bombing Hamas part. I got that. Cool. I understand that completely. But there's some other conversations that need to be happening. Because when it ends, there has to be a plan. Otherwise, history has shown us, if you don't plan, they will rise again. And on that note, I'm your guy. B period. Pray for Israel. Pray for the Middle East. Because we don't know what's coming and what's happening. And when it's all said and done, I pray that the right solution happens. Whatever that is. I'm done.